Welcome to Season 6 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is brought to you by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts institutions. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that I'm passionate about education, especially education that is accessible. With flexible online learning through Falmouth University, you can study from anywhere, starting in January, May, or September. Join the university that has nurtured the award-winning photographers Justin Carey, who we interviewed in Season 1, and Rehab El-Dalil, who we interviewed in Season 4. Falmouth graduates have been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and the BBC. If you're passionate about photography and want to refine your practice, Falmouth's specialist photography courses are designed for you. Led by expert academics and industry-savvy tutors, you'll develop your critical thinking and create work that explores powerful themes on a local, national, and international scale. Search Photography at Falmouth to find out more. Today, in episode number 8, we'll be talking with Heather Agyepong on embodiment and the self. Heather Agyepong is a British-Ghanaian visual artist and actor who lives and works in London. Her art practice is concerned with mental health and well-being, invisibility, the diaspora, and the archive. She uses both lens-based practices and performance with an aim to culminate a cathartic experience for both herself and the viewer. She adopts the technique of reimagination to engage with communities of interest and the self as a central focus within the image. She's been nominated for Prix Pictet and Paul Hough Award in 2016, 2018, and 2021. Her work exists in a number of collections, including Autograph ABP, Arts Council England, and the National Portrait Gallery, among many others. She was nominated for the South Bank Sky Arts Breakthrough Award 2018, awarded the Firecracker Photographic Grant 2020, and has been selected as part of Foam Talent 2021, Jerwood PhotoWorks Award 2022, Photo London Nikon Emerging Photographer Award 2021, and the Photographers Gallery New Talent Award 2021. She's a Nikon European Ambassador and was selected as an exhibiting artist for Taylor Wessing Photo Prize 2023. Could we start with you telling us a bit about the kind of work that you do?
Yes, so I am a visual artist and an actor. My visual art practice is kind of lens-based and performance-based. It's also kind of moving into movement. And the key themes of my work are mental health, invisibility, and radical truth-telling. And in the majority of my work, it's all self-portraiture.
Your work is so multidisciplinary. And I guess I want to know, how did you bring photography together with these things about movement and performance? Like, how did that come into your practice?
Yeah, very organically, actually. I picked up a camera when I was 19, and then I've been trained as an actor. And I guess I always wondered if I could kind of combine the two. I had a wonderful mentor, and she said, what about standing in front of the camera? And then all these other ways of being, these other mediums, just felt really organic. The project I wanted to do next was around moving and dance. I'm not a dancer at all, but I felt like my body really needed to move. So then movement practice was incorporated in it. It's more about what I'm feeling and what sort of medium I need. And then I fall into these different dimensions of making art.
I think that's really interesting because I think there's so much like self-trust in that as well, and like following your gut. And I think that's something that I don't know, maybe I should just, I was going to say a lot of creatives, but maybe I should just speak for myself, that I really struggle with. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
I love that, Savannah, so much. That's so affirming. I think the reason I make art is to trust myself and rediscover myself. I think for a long period of time, there was just so many different layers of who I was, which were kind of projected onto me, or what I believed I was as a woman, as a Black woman, as a woman who's neurodivergent. There were this kind of like bits of armor and bits of other people's stuff on me. So really, like, my quest in making art is to start removing those layers. And I guess whilst I'm removing the layers, I'm trusting myself more, which I've never really thought about until you've just said that. So yeah, it is trying to kind of regain a deep sense of trust with myself, because I think for a long period of time, I've kind of abandoned myself growing up to kind of suit other people's gazes.
I think that that's really interesting, what you're saying about using art to explore yourself, because also in your work, it seems like you also use your art to explore other people, like historical figures. And so I wonder if you could maybe speak about that a little bit and the relationship there.
Absolutely. So initially, with my first self-portrait project, I was using archival materials, especially like forgotten women in history. I think I identified that I had massive educational gaps in terms of like Black British women, their contributions, what they did. I mean, school spoke about like the transatlantic slavery and Windrush. There was like massive gaps of just no knowledge. And then when I started looking at archives and seeing like the breadth of Black British contributions, there felt like archival history allowed me to explore the present. There was something about looking back which helped me to understand my present circumstance, using these women from history to explore myself. So it was twofold. It was a discovery of these incredible contributions of Black women, but also asking myself, gosh, can I contribute in that sort of way? Is there any inspiration that these women can give me in my present circumstance?
Absolutely. And I guess, how do you think about that work? I guess I'm thinking, the theme of the podcast, the ethics. I'm thinking about like, when you're using archival materials, you're reflecting on the experiences of women from the past and you're bringing that into the present. How do you do that? Or how do you think about the ethics of also negotiating that sort of histories with today? Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. And also a brilliant question, and a question which was quite challenging because these women did exist, but there are massive gaps of knowledge. Some of their contributions have been erased. So I always use the word reimagination. Some people would say, oh, you're dressing up as Sarah Fawcett, or you're dressing up as Ada Overton Walker. And I'll say, no, I'm reimagining what their lives would have been like, because I think the issue around ethics happens when you pretend to know who they are or kind of describe this sort of objective truth about their life. But the truth is there are gaps. So in a way, my work wants to kind of pay homage to what we do know and how the little we know about them has impacted my own life. Yeah, because I think there's a violence sometimes happens with these women where, because of the lack of knowledge, they are created as like caricatures or their lives are reduced in some sort of way. So if anything, it feels like I'm trying to kind of repair some of the violence that happens in those old images. So that's a kind of ethical issue that I'm trying to repair in some way.
That's so interesting. It reminds me of something that Raymond Thompson Jr. said in our podcast episode. Are you familiar with his work?
Yes, yes.
Because he said something about, I'm going to get this so wrong. But he said something to the effect of, about how like when there is a gap of history and a gap of like when nothing exists there, sort of imagining. I think he said something about imagining also, and like imagining the possibilities can be a form of repair. And I think that that's interesting to see that parallel, because he's working obviously in the American context as well.
Absolutely.
So that's quite interesting. I think, you mentioned at the start as well, ideas of invisibility and truth telling. And it reminded me of something that I read on your website as well when you were, I can't remember which project this was, so maybe you can fill in the gap for me. But you were writing about the 3 E's of exclusion, exclusivity, and empire. And I guess I was wondering, like, how does that come into your both experience as an artist, but also the work that you're making, and in terms of maybe working against those 3 E's?
I love that. Yeah, I made a project called Yeah. Tate commissioned me to make it, and it was about cultural production and who gets to make culture, what is high art, what is kind of low art in terms of like the gallery context. And I think for me, remembering when I was entering kind of gallery spaces, 19, 17, 16, it felt so elitist and exclusive, and that you had to have this prior kind of art history knowledge to access the work, which has been something which I've just kind of have always pushed up against, because then art actually isn't accessible, really. If you need to have read like a book about Foucault or a book about Cubism to access the work, because it's all about gatekeeping. So I try to make my work very visceral, actually, that you probably even need to speak English to be impacted by the work. That's the hope. So the work always feels like it's kind of beyond words and not living in academia. Don't get me wrong, I did a master's. My work has a strong theoretical framework, but there are many entry points that all sorts of people can interact with the work, not just on an academic sphere. There's kind of a multi-layer experience. So yeah, that's just why I think my ethics are like art should be really accessible. Because I'm from South London, loads of people growing up, we never went to galleries. Do you know what I mean? It felt like it wasn't for us. So I'm trying to make the work for kind of everyone, if that's possible. That's the aim anyway.
I really love that, what you said about language, because I think that sometimes we do think of like, oh, like photographs are like beyond words. But I think that, you know, what you're describing is there's this like implicit knowledge that you are expected to have when you're reading some photographs or some works of art. And I think the point that you're making on, you know, English as well as a language, I think that that's something that can be very easy to forget if you're an English speaker, that, you know, so much of the internet we can access because so much is in English, but so much we will never know, you know, if we don't speak another language or read another language, we can't access. I think it's very easy to forget about linguistic accessibility when you're an English speaker. And so I think that the point that you're making about that, about, you know, not just beyond language, but beyond the English language, I think is a really powerful point.
Yeah, during my master's, I think I got a taste of that because it was very international course. I think there was 2 English people on that course, actually. And I thought some of the things I'm explaining, it can go over so many people's heads because my default is like, oh, but you understand me, right? So I think that master's really helped me understand how English can be a barrier. Is there any way to kind of make it more accessible in some sort of way? I mean, it's an attempt. I don't think I could do it perfectly, but my work's not really about perfection. It's just the attempt and the intention of making something accessible.
What do you think maybe are other ways that photography as a industry or medium can sort of work toward that goal of accessibility that you're describing that's so fundamental in your work? And I guess what other ways can either individual photographers or institutions embed that idea of accessibility and inclusion, working against the 3 E's of exclusion, exclusivity, and empire in their work?
I think, I mean, for me, it was the price point of cameras. Actually, that was the first major barrier. Like, people spoke so much about learning the mechanics of photography through film cameras, but I mean, to print and everything was impossible. Like, the reason I worked digitally, because I was skin, I had no money. And there's one thing about putting your camera on kind of manual, but you really learn the mechanics of photography and light with film camera. So I was introduced to a film camera, I remember it was when I was 22. No one ever spoke to me about photography. There was no conversation about that being a viable art form. And there's also something really strange in this country where photography is seen as kind of like the lesser art forms. When I go to the States, there is such a kind of reverence for photography. So I think in terms of the UK, we're kind of light years behind how transformative that art practice actually is. So there's also like a value system, which I think needs to change around photography. But also, I remember when I was working in a photography centre, they'll give people like disposable cameras. Even that entry point, it's a kind of a low art form. There's such a class signalling, which happens a lot in the UK of, oh, you used a disposable camera. Like, there is such a judgment on that, actually, but you can make stunning images from that. So I think it's about a different reverence and appreciation of how photography can be an impactful art form, but also access financially to those tools too. I mean, the darkrooms are all going, like, no one's funding them. Often they're the private people who are funding them, and then the price points are really expensive. There's like a whole generation of photographers that might not get there because of money, which is devastating.
Absolutely, yeah. Like darkroom materials and analog equipment and film itself, you know,
Yes,
is
yes.
just so expensive. I think it's really interesting what you're saying as well about like how there's this whole generation of photographers that might not be able to access that. And I used to work only in digitally because I didn't know how to do anything in the darkroom. And I had the benefit of learning how to do analog photography during the pandemic. And I think I really enjoyed that because it was very tactile. I liked working with my hands. It's interesting because I was thinking about, for me, that was a kind of embodiment and like how I can feel more embodied and be making photographs. But embodiment is so pervasive in your work. I feel like maybe I'm a chronically unembodied person or like disembodied, I guess, person. So I guess I was just really curious about that idea of embodiment in photography and how you see that in your work as well.
I also think, Savannah, everyone's disembodied. Like we're like the culture is really disembodied. So I think it's always a quest to kind of step into your body. I love that question around slowing down. I think that's why I really admire analog photographers, because there is a slowing down. It's not this sort of rush to make the image. And in my digital work, I try to do the same thing. So Ego Death, my last project, I would do like a whole day shoot and I wouldn't look at the images. I would have my shutter on, my handheld shutter. And when I felt like the right moment was happening in my body, I would take a picture. So it forced me to slow down because I couldn't see the images, but also it forced me to listen to my body to find out where's that moment. And it wasn't a visual cue. There was no like a laptop in front of me to see my movements because I was moving through the entire series. I didn't stop moving to make those images. It was more about what was happening in my own body for me to feel like this is the moment to take the shot. And I created all of these images, which I probably wouldn't have been very critical of if I actually saw them in real time. So there's something about giving it up to the camera and trying to make the camera not a critical viewer, actually, more like an organ or more like a witness or an observer. So you kind of take the power back from that gaze. It becomes less of a critical observer, more of just like someone witnessing you. That's really how I want to work now, in a very, very slow way.
I think that's a really interesting way of working. I mean, there's a lot that you said there that I think is really inspiring about the way that you used your body really intuitively, and also like you were able to avoid that self-judgment or that self-criticism during the process, which I do think sometimes can really hold us up. I guess I want to know also about, remind me of the title of the work that is showing right now.
Ego Death and The Body Remembers is a performance, and the exhibition is called Through Motion.
Through Motion, yes. Okay, absolutely. So I don't know, I'd love to hear more about how you conceptualized this project, because I've not had the privilege of seeing it, but it seems to me that it's sort of like the next life of this Ego Death project that is then being like brought to life in a physical way for viewers. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, so The Body Remembers was a performance I did in 2011, and then Ego Death was kind of born out of that. But the reason those two pieces of work are together is because it was quite a fundamental shift in my practice in terms of movement. Everything's been still till now and kind of performance-based, but The Body Remembers isn't actually really a performance in the traditional sense. There's a thing called authentic movement, and it's coined by this woman called Mary Stark Whitehouse in the 60s. And it's about letting your body move authentically without a filter. So you just let your body move. It's not about anyone's gaze. Your eyes are often closed. Mary believed that trauma lives in the body. And if you've been through something traumatic, movement therapy can really become quite cathartic. When I was making that project, my therapist said, I think you've been through something traumatic. And I said, okay, something I really want to do is move. And she said, oh, movement practice can be very important with healing processes. So the performance is me moving unfiltered. It's kind of an improvised movement. And the other part of authentic movement is witnesses. So often it will be like a therapist watching the movement and not just analysing what they're seeing, but also what's happening in their own body. So it's this kind of collective experience of you watching someone move authentically and question, how do I feel? What does that mean for me? What is that bringing up? So it's this whole cathartic experience. I did it for months and months in 2011, but this is the first time that work is going to be shown and people can experience the whole performance kind of live for 45 minutes. There's moments of the project where there's like a stark light on me and there's a big shadow in the back. And I remember I was thinking something about shadows feels really significant. I don't know why I keep thinking about that. And then Ego Death, which is about exploring the concept of the shadow and parts of yourself that are hidden. That's how Ego Death was born. But both of those projects happened when I move unconsciously. That's the link, and that's kind of the journey of those two projects.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think that idea of authentic movement, that sounds familiar to me. What's the book called? It's called
The Body Keeps the Score?
Yes.
Or... Yes.
Thank you. Yes. He talks about that in that book, right? Yeah. Okay.
He does, yeah.
I was like, I know I've heard this somewhere, I've read this somewhere. Okay, that's really interesting. And I guess to maybe go back as well to the theme that you highlighted at the start about invisibility. You are making yourself hyper visible in this work. How do you care for yourself, or how do you think about that? And how did you also make the decision, like, especially if, through working with a therapist, it was recognized that this was also self-healing in response to trauma. How did you make the decision to make that visible and to make that public?
Love that. The thing around trauma or mental health, I think why I'm so obsessed with the idea about invisibility is that you can't see it. Only the manifestations of it when it gets chronic or really bad is that when you see someone's kind of life being affected. So I really wanted to show what particularly PTSD looks like, because you can describe the feeling internally, but you can't really see it. So that was what the Body Remembers was about people kind of having a radical sense of empathy by seeing how the trauma looks like. And for me, one of my big things around care, I had a therapist throughout the whole process, Dawn Estefan, and I worked in community. So I interviewed Black British women of all ages. I think the oldest person was 70, about how trauma looks like and feels like and what healing looks like to them. So I interviewed them, and throughout the piece, you hear all of these women's voices talking about what trauma looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like, and what healing is to them. So something about when I worked with the collective, it felt like we were like joining hands together and we were creating this whole collective process, which feels incredibly cathartic to me. Before, I've used women from history, but I always want my work to have a sense of community in it. I feel like people are behind me, like championing me or supporting me in that way. So yeah, always working with collective has been really useful. And I had quite strict practice, actually. People were crying at the end of the work or wanted to shout or wanted to move their bodies. It's an incredibly emotive thing. Even I actually haven't watched the performance through because I'm just like, it's not for me. It's kind of for them. I never spoke to anyone after the show. I went straight home, had a shower, kind of derobed. So I was quite strict in terms of self-preservation, because when you watch the piece, a lot of stuff come up for you. And I wanted to make sure like that stuff isn't mine. I feel really blessed that I've been able to kind of unlock that for someone, but that doesn't belong to me. I just kind of had to really cocoon myself during that period of time. I know like I'm not a therapist, but I'm hoping that this has kind of therapeutic benefits to people and then they can kind of start their own journey about healing.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, the way that you describe that, because first of all, I guess that idea of interviewing people and having their voices sort of overlaid into the work, like I can picture what you're saying about how like it isn't then just you by yourself up there, you have that collective sort of experience, that sort of validation of your experience, I guess, behind you, which makes a lot of sense. But on the other hand, I think it's really interesting, that idea, I guess, push and pull, right? Of relationship with others.
Yes.
Having the benefit of the common experience, the shared experience, but also knowing when to put a boundary up for yourself. And I think that is so important and something that can be very difficult to do, especially if you're working in community. I think it can be very easy for people to feel like they have to keep giving of themselves. And I think knowing that moment when you say, oh, actually, like that's not the moment that this project is at anymore, and I need to do something to protect myself, requires so much self-knowledge and awareness. And I think it's really important for people to hear that it's okay. You don't have to do that. You don't have to take on and take on and take on constantly. It's okay to put up that boundary. Does that make sense?
100%. No, it makes complete sense, especially artists who put themselves in the work. Right now it is a lot. A lot of people are really struggling and project a lot of stuff onto the work. And I think for me, I'm like, I don't have the answer, but I hope that I can help start the journey. Do you know what I mean? So it is really identifying what is mine and what is not mine. I mean, I was asked to do like a tour, go to Australia and do this performance, but I'm like, no, the time's done now. Because I think if I did the Body Members again, it would be a lie. It would be like a fake thing, because at that moment, I really needed to move, and I've done it now. And then I'm on to the next thing. So I also think it's knowing when things end. I'm glad it was filmed so people can still experience it. But for me, like, I'm at a different stage. Like all of my projects, by the time they're released, like I'm not there anymore. So it also feels easy for people to critique it because I'm like, that was like old Heather. For me, the most
Very
important
ego
thing.
death.
Yes, so ego death, right? I know. I'm like, there is such a freedom. It doesn't belong to me anymore. And it's a past version who I mourn and love, but that isn't me. In terms of safety, I always make sure that I've processed something before I start making a project. I don't want to do anything live or something that feels still delicate or raw. I want to have got to a place where I can kind of look back in a way.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So you do the self work or the inner work and the processing yourself before you share it, I guess. And
Yeah,
before you, yeah.
yeah. I think the work is always like the last chapter of something. Healing is a constant thing, but in terms of that specific thing, I've processed it. I've got a revelation of something that's happened. It doesn't belong to me anymore.
And what kinds of resources have you drawn from? And I guess I'm thinking both in terms of your creative approach, your approach to protecting yourself and, that process that you're describing, and also maybe in terms of like the ethics of your work and how you think about the ethics of your work. Or is that something that has been really like intuitive for you?
It was learning actually. When I did my master's, my first project was like a photojournalistic project. I thought I wanted to be a photojournalist. I was very young and misguided and thought, I'm going to show the truth about what's happening here. And my initial intentions around photography, especially being kind of like this Ghanaian girl. And I had quite problematic views about Ghana, even though I had been there very rarely, and I realised it was because of the visual culture I was getting UK side of depictions of what was happening in Ghana, what was happening in sub-Saharan Africa, all of these kind of really violent, distorted images of the country made a lot of us growing up think, oh, we don't want to be associated with that because the images were just so skewed. My first project in my MA, I went to this place called Agbog Bloshi, which is a massive e-waste dump site in the center of the capital city in Ghana called Accra. And basically e-waste from the States and the UK gets dumped there. I wanted to go there because it had been heavily photographed and people have won loads of awards by this kind of like hellish place in Ghana. So I was like, I'm going to go there and just find out what's going on. And then my heart completely broke because what was going on was that the place was just heavily exploited. There were tons of photographers there when I went. There were tours. People were taking blood samples from the boys. What happens is that young boys will burn all the e-waste and they'll get like precious materials and then they'll sell that. There was a bank there. There was actually kind of an ecosystem of like commerce and people lived there and children were there and it was really organized. And when I spoke to the boys, I'm from Ghana, so I could speak the language, they were just saying, people take pictures of us and say that, oh, we'll build you a school, we'll build you a house, and then never come back. And then we'll find out that they've won like all of these massive awards. So it was a space of real deep exploitation. That was my big learning of like how dangerous photography can be. And the boys were talking about, people think we're criminals and villains because our photos are like all over the world, but actually we're just homeless boys or boys who have come from places on the outskirts of the capital to just make some money. And we're kind of vilified. I was there for 6 weeks, kind of lived with those boys. And it was just a massive eye-opener of like objectivity in photography and the myth of like photography always being the truth. So after that, it just blew my mind. And then I decided not to take pictures of other people after that. I felt it was such a like foundational, shattering baptism of fire process that I just said, if I want to talk about truth, it's going to be about myself because I have complete control over that. My truth is the truth in terms of like my experience of truth. And I didn't want to photograph anybody else. Maybe it was a fear of like creating damaging images. So yeah, that project was transformative for me.
Yeah, no, that sounds really harrowing and also really impactful. And I mean, it definitely sounds like it really set you on the path that you're on now, which you might not have otherwise pursued. I always like to think that even if we look back and we're like, oh, I wouldn't do that again, it's taught us something or it's led us somewhere or we've learned in some way from that. And I think that that can always be useful if we're reflective about it.
This is it. My big thing is, in terms of photography and ethics, I am so self-reflective in terms of like, how is my body impacting the space I'm photographing? what does my cultural baggage, who I am, affect the image? I'm really like on ethics of photography after that, because whatever you're photographing, your body being in that space has changed the space somehow. And as long as people acknowledge that, I'm really happy with that. If they don't and say, this is just the truth, it's like, no, what's happening around the edges? Why have you photographed that and not that thing? Because the images you produce have an effect on the people that are in the images and how people are seen. I'm from South London. A lot of us grew up, had negative ideas about sub-Saharan Africa, but purely because of images. Some of us never even stepped foot on the continent. Do you know what I mean? But because of the images we were being fed, it kind of created a deep effect on our identity that some of us are still like unlearning now. And I'm not saying they're all photographers. Photographers are the reason this is the case, but visual culture definitely played a massive impact in that. And I think that's why I make images which feel kind of nuanced and specific to me, because that level of nuance wasn't around growing up, you know? And I also, that's why I love this podcast, actually. These questions are so important. They actually affect people's psyches, who they are. So I think the constant conversation is something that I wish I had like 15 years ago. So Savannah, you're doing the Lord's work, babe.
I appreciate that. Thanks so much. No. And I think that, you know, that idea of sort of turning in and turning the lens on ourselves is a really growing theme right now. I think people are becoming a lot more aware over positionality, you know, like you're describing. And I think that there's a real trend in photographers turning the lens on themselves and doing more work and more exploration about themselves or their families. And I think part of that is maybe in response to a fear sometimes over like, what can I comment on? What can I photograph? Where should I be? Where do I have the right to be? You know, where am I well positioned? Or what am I well positioned to speak to? And so I think some of those thoughts are really useful. I think fear is always a little bit tricky. But I guess in light of that and with that awareness, that is, I think, a growing area. Like, what advice would you give to people who are wanting to do more work about themselves and share that with the world? I guess advice both in terms of, you know, you've talked a little bit about your process and things, but I guess I'm thinking also about like output and where that goes in the world and how that's seen. Because I think, again, thinking about myself, sorry.
Yes.
But thinking of my own creative practice, I think that sometimes I have a fear of being navel gazing. I think, you know, trying to think about how will it function in the world can be a really helpful way of reframing that for me. But I don't know if that makes sense for you.
No, it makes total sense. I think the navel gazing happens when you're more concerned on the audience than why you're doing it for yourself. I think something about knowing your clear why and your intention, that voice of what people think and like, am I being really self-indulgent? It's just quietens because you're like, no, I've got an intention of doing something for myself. The main focus for me is like, I'm doing this for myself. What do I need? What questions am I asking about myself? And then kind of the presentation about it, that question around audience happens after. If I'm honest, I think the audience stuff, every time I've thought in that sort of way, like, am I just being really self-indulgent? It's affected the work really poorly. And I've made work that I'm considering the audience so much, it's actually navel gazing. Do you know what I mean? Something about the authenticity of the real questions kind of shines through my work when I'm just focusing on my intention. I think that's why I struggle in the commercial sphere, because I don't care about the audience in that much. Like, I'm making the work primarily for me. And maybe that's why the work sells. I'm thinking about if someone was in my shoes, like, what would they want to see? And for me, it's like my authentic truth, the messiness of that. So maybe it's about positioning your intention more clearly in a world where everybody's thinking about the audience. I think people can see through it, you know?
I think that's really, really interesting. Yeah, for sure. I guess just to follow on from that, when you are sharing work that can evoke so much for audiences and that deals with maybe traumatic histories, is there anything that you have to think about when you're sharing that in terms of protecting the audience?
Great question. I love to write about my work. So there's often like extended essays. I love doing talks to talk about the context of where the work came from. Because I always work with a therapist, this idea around re-traumatizing people is always like in my mind, in terms of, I don't want to create images of violence, but images which will create questions or provocations. Like in the Body Remembers, that performance, we never mentioned the traumatic event. So there was nothing which should be triggering that sort of way. I'm very careful to not traumatize people because those images exist and have existed forever. And my work is more about healing. But unfortunately, to heal, you kind of need to go through the crap, right? So sometimes it can feel really messy, but my work is always around like completing the circle, or something about moving through something rather than like being stuck. All the traumatic things kind of no one really knows about in the work. People are seeing like the end product of going through the journey or coming out the other end or something. So the work tries not to create any sort of panic in the observer, more like being seen. And sometimes being seen is more scary actually than like the shock of a horrific event. I think being seen can feel really petrifying, but it's a necessary evil to kind of get through the healing journey.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that all makes great sense. And then the last question that I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
Maybe three things: an empathetic ear, selfless reflection, and progress. Yeah, I think the history of photography has been ethnographic, anthropological, and I think that often haunted photography for a very long time. And I guess the progress idea is that we need to evolve from this idea that it's truth or about othering. I think photography at its best is about connectivity. So yeah, and I think it's the responsibility of the photographer to kind of engage with those three things.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is sponsored by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts universities. In a world where images shape narratives, ethical photography has never been more important. At Falmouth University, the online photography MA helps you master your craft while exploring the responsibilities of visual storytelling. Learn from industry experts, challenge conventions, and develop work with integrity, all from almost anywhere in the world. Join a global community of photographers committed to making a difference. Search Falmouth online and book a call with a course advisor today. Join me next week when we hear from Jessie Alexander about creative sustainability.